This is Lisa from Mobile Tech Review, and today we're going to do an Android tablet smackdown between the new kid on the block, the Sony Xperia Tablet Z, and a real cult classic favorite here. This is the Nexus 10 by Google and built by Samsung, and we're going to compare them now. Another smackdowns here, this time between two top tablets available, both running Android, both with 10.1-inch displays with wide viewing angles and high resolution. Here we have the Google Nexus 10. It's been on the market since December of 2012. Still a pretty popular tablet with a lot of folks. It's actually available in retailers. You can get it places other than Google's own website, in other words. And here we have the Sony Xperia Tablet Z. Just starting to show up in stores. The Sony is $499 for the 16 gig and $599 for the 32 gig. Obviously, we have the white model. You can see a little bit of white bezel showing. If you get the 16 gig, it's black only. If you choose the 32 gig, you have your choice of black or white. Nexus, a little bit more affordable, $399 for the 16 gig. Here's the thing. If you want the 16 gig, the cheaper one, you do have to order from Google's website because stores tend to stock the 32 gig, which is $499. And regardless of capacity, you have your choice of black, or black with the Nexus. That's what it is. Both of these tablets run Android Jelly Bean. You get a slightly newer version on the Nexus because that's what Nexus is about. You always get the latest, greatest version of the Android operating system. It has 4.2.2 versus 4.1.2 on the Sony. Sony says 4.2 update is coming. They're not going to be as fast ever as a Nexus tablet, certainly for those kind of updates. And interestingly, a lot of manufacturers for smartphones and tablets have stuck with 4.1.2. I think it's a little bit more stable, that's why. So that's another thing to keep in mind with the Nexus. You might get the latest, greatest OS, but occasionally, as we discovered with our Nexus 7, sometimes the latest, greatest isn't quite as well-baked as we'd like, and there are some quirks with those things. Both of these are fast tablets, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of that in a minute. But first, I think one of the things that's going to set these apart for the average user, the not-super technical user, is their build, their style, and how light they are. And that's where the Sony's going to pull ahead because it's crazy, wacky, light, and thin, really marvelously thin. 0.27 inches, really, really skinny. Skinniest tablet on the market right now. Also very light, 1.09 pounds. It's trivial to hold compared to other tablets. And yeah, I can even feel the difference between this and my Nexus 10. Polycarbonate, matte finish. I think the black one's a little bit more styling myself, but that's a matter of personal preference. Matte, and it doesn't really show fingerprints. That's very nice. Another thing about the Sony, it's washable. No kidding, really it is. It has little flaps over the ports. If you watch our full review of this, you know that. Because it is waterproof to 1 meter or 3 feet for up to 30 minutes, and it's also dust proof. So you get it dirty, you stand out in the rain, you're hanging out at the pool and you get splashed. It's not the end of the world. And here's our buddy, the Nexus 10. This is my personal Nexus 10. So fanboys out there who might feel like the Nexus 10 is just not holding up so well against the Sony, sorry, it's my personal Nexus 10. I really like the Nexus 10, but I have to say in some ways it's going to be beaten by the Sony. Anyway, very interesting. Kind of reminds me of an old tube TV with the rounded corners look. It's kind of retro. It's kind of homely, both in the U.S. and the British sense of the words. It's not the best looking tablet, but in a way, it's really, well, comfortable, homey, easy to hold and grip. The back here has this rubbery finish here, which surprisingly picks up fingerprint oil instantly. I mean, I just cleaned this off and 2 seconds later it's dirty again. But other than that, it feels really nice to hold. It may not be quite as skinny at 0.35 inches, but nice, comfortable. It doesn't feel quite as oblong, rectangular-wise as the Sony does, so when you're holding it in portrait mode, it doesn't feel quite as awkward. It's funny because the dimensions really aren't that different between them, but that's just the way it is. Anyway, this is also plastic. It's pretty rugged. You get a little bit of creak when you press on the back, but you can achieve the same thing with the Sony. But overall, it's not something I feel like you have to be careful with. It's kind of a ruggedized case on it. Weighs 1.33 pounds, so that's not too much difference from 1.09 pounds, is it? Well, I can really feel the difference, like I said. So it does matter. And certainly if you're considering even heavier tablets, well, like the iPad that's 1.5 pounds almost, you're really going to notice the difference. Speaking of other tablets, I know some of you who have asked for a comparison between the Xperia Tablet Z and the Samsung Galaxy Note 10. And I would say pretty much hands down, unless you need the S Pen on the Samsung Galaxy Note 10.1, otherwise the Sony's going to outclass it in every way for specs. Higher resolution, full HD display, more features on it. So there you have it. So unless you need that digital pen, which the Sony doesn't have, nor does the Nexus 10. there's your choice. Now when it comes to displays, both of these have top-notch displays near the top end of the Android spectrum currently. The Nexus gets there by having a wildly high resolution, 2560 by 1600 pixels, and that's a PLS display. That's Samsung's technology that's similar to IPS. The Sony has a 1920 by 1200 pixel display, so full HD plus a little extra height as well, and very wide viewing angles. It uses their mobile Bravia 2 engine, which really brings out colors and contrast, and it adjusts dynamically depending on the content you're looking at. So you get a really nice visual experience. I thought my Nexus 10 was a pretty nice looking tablet until I saw it next to the Xperia Tablet Z here. Look at the difference in the green. See how rich and vibrant and bright green it is right here, these little trees? And this is just a little bit dull looking. And obviously the level of the contrast here is higher on the Sony as well. So pixels aren't everything. I mean, once you go up to full HD or full HD plus like we've got on the Sony in the same 10.1 inch size, I mean, I think you've got plenty enough pixels there. This is 224 ppi versus 300. Even if you've got eagle eyes, this is pretty nice looking. But for those of you who really, really have sharp eyes and want to see the most sharp possible text, still the Nexus 10 has its appeal for that because you're getting absolutely more pixels there. Now, at the Nexus 10, you're going to get that pure Android experience. There's no UI overlay on top of it. Just is what it is, and it's fast. It's nice. I don't say that that's a bad thing. Often I've felt that customizations done by manufacturers have actually helped make Android a little bit more friendly and usable and expedient. But in this case, Google is on the right track with their tablet UI here. The new way of getting to your app drawer is this little center dot right over there in your launcher dock. And if you want to get to your settings quickly, something that third parties used to have to add on, well, now you've got this right here, so I can actually access my Wi-Fi, I can change my brightness, I can get to other things. So pretty nice and expedient. Now the software that's loaded here is going to be the basics. You're going to get everything that Google makes pretty much. You know, you're going to get your Google Plus, you're going to get the email app, the YouTube app, all that kind of stuff, which you'll also get on the Sony, and you're not going to really get anything else because, well, it's a pure basic Android experience. So you're going to have to take Google Play yourself and download things. Now, if you're already familiar with Android and you have your favorite apps, that's absolutely cool, and that's probably the way you want it. You don't want a lot of extra stuff. But for those of you who are more newbies, you don't always know what you need, and you want some software to get you started, manufacturer customized tablets like the Sony Xperia Tablet Z can actually be good. Now here we have the old style way of doing things that you remember from honeycomb tablets. Tap up here to get to your launcher dock, get a little fancy transparency thing here. And besides Sony's suite of apps for their movie streaming, their music streaming services, they've loaded Crackle on here, which you could also download on the Nexus 10. That's streaming TV and movies. But I'll tell you one thing, Crackle is usually pretty, well, cracky on other products, but it always works well on Sony. And we've got an Office suite pre-installed on here. Now, this is just an Office viewer. And again, you can download Office viewers for free on the Google Nexus 10 if you want to, but something else that you get, if we go back home over here, and here, you can see we've got these little quick launcher icons down here at the bottom for some customization. One of them is an added hardware feature, and that's the AV remote, and that's the small view, so you can just pop that up really quickly, move it around if you want to control your home theater gear, your TV, your receiver, your cable box, all that kind of stuff. Nice to have that as consumer IR port. No such thing on the Nexus 10. It's a frugal, no extra frills kind of product. Tries to be powerful, tries to have a good display, doesn't add on that kind of bells and whistles. Another thing they have is small apps. If you touch over here, you can see a palette of applications, and you can turn widgets into small apps and download some more off Google Play. Unfortunately, you can't add every single app that's available on Android or even pre-installed on the tablet to this, but say we want the browsers. Tap on that guy right there. And now I've got a little floating web browser. And it's resizable besides, which is kind of neat. If I can grab onto the right thing. There we go. So, things like that you're going to find pretty much on Samsung tablets. LG does this with their smartphones, and now Sony's doing this here. The concept of having some floating applications or split window multitasking. Kind of a nice thing right there. Manufacturer customization sometimes can slow down the tablet, but Sony goes for a pretty light touch here. So they really haven't bogged down the UI. It's not like Samsung TouchWiz where you know there's just so much going on top of Android that sometimes things can slow down. So no complaints there. It's very fast. You get your multi-screen desktop. You get a little indicator up here to tell you what desktop you're on. You get a couple of Sony widgets, but not a whole lot of overwhelming things. Both of these are honestly very fast tablets. I think the Nexus 10 is going to have a little bit of an advantage because it has that pure Google Android experience going on there. Absolutely nothing to slow it down. But when we get into the hardware specs, certainly on benchmarks, the Sony is the winner. And to be fair, it's a newer tablet. Nexus came out in December of 2012. Sony came out in June of 2013. So we see some advancement. Basically, the Sony is running on one of the higher-end smartphone CPUs, which is a quad-core Qualcomm Snapdragon S4 Pro CPU clocked at 1.5 gigahertz. On the Nexus 10, we have a 1.7 gigahertz Exynos 5 dual-core CPU versus the quad-core here. Now, core numbers are not always everything, but this is an ARM A15 CPU architecture. Is a little bit newer, a little bit more efficient sometimes versus the A9 architecture that's used in the Snapdragon CPUs. Both of these guys have 2 gigs of RAM. In terms of synthetic benchmarks, the Sony wins on just about everything. For example, on Quadrant, the Sony scores 7450 versus 4959 for our Nexus 10. On Antutu, the Sony scores 20,517 versus 13,653. GL benchmark. Now, graphics get to be interesting here. We have Mali graphics here, and we have Adreno 320 graphics here, and it depends on what test you use. First, we'll talk about GL benchmark, which has been around for quite some time, so it's a standard on Android, and the Sony tablet Xperia Z scored 32 frames per second on screen and 31 frames per second off screen. In contrast, the Nexus 10 scored 28 frames per second on screen and 39 frames per second off screen. That's because the on-screen resolution is actually so high, particularly on the Nexus 10, that's why. But when we take a look at the newer test, which is 3D Mark, their Ice Storm test. Now, 3D Mark has been making PC benchmarks for quite some time. They are working on doing everything cross-platform these days. They are not biased towards any particular graphics card. You really can't be a staple of the PC benchmarking world if you are. We get slightly different skew there. We got 44.2 frames per second in the Ice Storm test on the Sony tablet Xperia Z, and the demo scored 49 frames per second, so that's quite good. On the Nexus 10, we actually got somewhat lower numbers. We got 37.1 frames per second for the Ice Storm test, and the demo was 25.5. So it's interesting what happens when you switch tools, and I have to say I have a little bit more faith in PC Mark and 3D Mark to actually do a better job, especially when it comes to comparing two different chipsets here for graphics. Now, when it comes to Sun Spider, both of these come with the Chrome web browser. They do not come with the old WebKit web browser, so we're using Chrome for the tests on both of these. Nexus 10 did a little better. Sun Spider was 1308 versus 1501 for the Sony tablet Xperia Z. Speaking of Chrome, neither of these comes with Adobe Flash Player because Google really doesn't want to see that on your device anymore. That's because Adobe has dropped support for that. You can side load it on either of these and install something like Boat Browser, which is free, and that actually does work with Adobe Flash. So you're in the same boat either way, no pun intended, with Adobe Flash on these tablets. In terms of other specs, both tablets have NFC, they have dual band Wi-Fi, and the Nexus has Bluetooth 3.0 and the Sony has Bluetooth 4.0. Sony has a 2 megapixel front camera, the Nexus has a 1.9 megapixel camera, close enough to call it a draw, and actually both have pretty good quality front cameras for video chat. That's pretty much what you're going to be using these for, and the occasional selfie. Now, speaking of cameras, on the back here, Nexus has a 5 megapixel camera, pretty much like your average Galaxy tablet camera. It's not bad. It does have a flash. It's always nice to see on a tablet and not too common. And the Sony tablet has an 8.1 megapixel camera with an Exmor R sensor, and it does HDR. So you can guess which is going to be the best camera, right? The Sony. Now, the Sony camera isn't as good as something like the Sony Z smartphone, 13 megapixel. It's not just about megapixels either. This guy has some problems getting contrast right. Often the darker areas are a little bit underexposed, but if you have good lighting, it takes really nice pictures. If you're taking outdoor photos, you'll get really nice color saturation, reasonable sharpness, all that kind of thing. Again, contrast could use a little adjustment. Even the HDR feature doesn't do as much as it could to adjust for contrast. The Nexus, in contrast, has a very basic software camera. The settings are not as myriad. There's no HDR in this, but it does do that full 360 panorama view. That's pretty cool. Overall, I would say the Sony has the better camera, though the Nexus pulls ahead a little bit in low light settings. I mean, like really dim indoor settings. Now, when it comes to the camera UIs, at first they don't look too different. They try not to clutter up your viewfinder here with too much stuff. Well, with the Sony, if you're using Intelligent Auto, it actually takes away a bunch of other settings because it's figuring out everything for you. But you can see we have a bunch of different picture effects. And you can watch our video review to learn more about that. But say we just choose normal mode. Then we have HDR as an option, turning that on and off, EV compensation, even more settings, a lot of stuff right here. With the Nexus, it has that circle in the center UI thing here. And let's see if we can get that to pop up. And this is a little hard to show you because I have to keep holding my finger here. But you can see there's some basic settings here. Flash on, off. A little bit of a weird UI, honestly. Your EV compensation. A couple of things like that. So Sony has more features and it has an Intelligent Auto that is pretty darn intelligent. By the way, they can both shoot 1080p video. Sony has a 6,000 milliamp battery that's sealed inside. The Nexus 10 has a 9,000 milliamp battery that's sealed inside. So you would think the Nexus 10 is going to last a whole lot longer. But honestly, you know, it doesn't have a reputation as being an Energizer Bunny by any means. It's not one of the longer-lived 10-inch Android tablets. The even higher resolution display is more demanding of power. And the Exynos CPU is a pretty power-hungry beast. So far, using both of these, I've had about the same run times with each of them. So pretty much a draw there for battery life. When it comes to ports, both of these guys have 3.5mm headphone jacks. They have micro USB ports. The Nexus 10 has a micro HDMI port, while the Sony goes with HDMI out via MHL adapters. You're going to have to pick up the MHL adapter if you want to do that. Sony has all the ports under little rubber doors because, well, it's waterproof and dustproof, so that's the way it is. If you never get dirty or play in the water, then you're going to find those annoying. Otherwise, you'll appreciate them just fine. When it comes to USB, the Sony has USB host. Really nice to see. It works with Sony's own USB host adapter, a little dongle adapter they've been selling for their older tablets, and it works with some generic third-party ones we have. It works with flash drives, game controllers, keyboards, mice. It does not work with external hard drives. It doesn't put out enough power. However, it can charge your PlayStation DualShock 3 controller, and it has drivers built in to work with that wirelessly, which is really cool, or over USB if you want. Nexus 10 is a little bit of a strange case. For some reason, they disabled the mass storage for USB host feature. You can use game controllers, keyboards, mice, that kind of thing. So I picked up something called Nexus Media Importer. It's like $1 or so. It's a utility that actually enables that feature, so you can mount external drives on the Nexus. A very important thing is the Sony has a micro SD card slot to expand your storage. Now with Android 4.0 and up, you cannot install apps to cards, but you can install all of your media, your movies, your music, your documents, all that kind of stuff. So expandable with SD cards up to SDXC high capacity cards. Nexus, Google hates removable storage. They want to see it going away, so you cannot expand storage, which means you probably should get the 32 gig unless your requirements are pretty darn light there, because what you got is what you got. You can't expand it. When it comes to web browsing, both of these are fast and responsive. Pinch zooming, HTML5 video is supported. You can see that the whites are a little bit warmer on the Sony, which I actually like better. It's a little bit easier on the eyes. It's up to you how you feel about that kind of thing. They're pretty close when it comes to brightness. The Nexus 10 is about 20 nits brighter, which isn't a real big difference there. Again, with the Sony, the thing that you're really going to notice is the difference in color saturation and contrast, which is superior. But then again, you're going to get even slightly sharper on text if your eyes are good enough to see it on the Nexus 10. And how about when it comes to gaming? Now, don't get distracted. Again, you're going to notice the really nicer, more vibrant colors on the Sony right here. But now that we're not talking about that, these are both very fast tablets. They are more than capable of handling any game on the market. The Nexus 10, some people have complained that it bogs down a little bit in games once in a while because it has an even higher resolution display. The more pixels you have to push, the more performance is going to suffer. But honestly, I've really enjoyed using it for gaming, including demanding games like, well, Bard's Tale right here and Real Racing 3, those kind of games. Lastly, as we get into multimedia, the Sony, by the way, has an FM radio, something you don't always see in tablets, so those of you who love FM radio, that's there for you. But we're going to talk about speakers right now. Both of these can handle 1080p video playback, no problem. They're more than capable enough. They're some of the fastest tablets on the block. But speakers, you would think the Nexus 10 has an advantage. These little grills right here are little front-facing speakers. That's something that Samsung's been doing on their Galaxy tablets lately, and since they make the Nexus 10, we get the same benefit there. So it should be the louder tablet, shouldn't it? The Sony, on the other hand, has speakers that fire off of the corners. A little slit here, a little slit here for your left speaker, and likewise the same thing going here. And I'll say the Sony is not super duper loud. It doesn't have super duper bass, but surprisingly, it's been louder than my Nexus 10. So let's compare.
Choice is yours, because right now, Korea, Japan...
We're almost at max volume, by the way.
All over the world. Guys are training 24/7.
Nexus 10 is just not a loud tablet. And here's the same thing on the Sony. I have to shout over it. And look at the color saturation and contrast. So, well, the Sony certainly is louder for those of you who need to combat other people who are in the room and you want to be the noisier person. Both of these have pretty nice sound out through headphones and Bluetooth. Again, I would give Sony the edge there. They know a lot about making home theater gear, AV equipment, that kind of thing, and this sounds particularly nice through headphones. So there you have it, the tale of two tablets that are at the higher end for Android tablets. Obviously, the Nexus 10 is going to be a little bit cheaper. It's $100 less. It's a little bit older by about 6 months, and you know how technology is. It rolls forward. So it's a little bit less cutting edge in terms of performance, but still one of the faster tablets on the block. You're going to get that higher resolution display here. You're going to get better color and contrast on the Sony, and also a lighter and thinner tablet. And yes, it is noticeable. More creature comforts, more fancy features, your FM radio, your AV remote control here. The appeal of the Nexus is you get pure Android. For those of you who just want to play with ROMs and you don't want any added-on software by the manufacturer, that certainly has its appeal. By the way, either of these can be rooted and you can put custom ROMs on either. Sony is actually very open with the developer community, which is pretty cool. So they actually support folks who tinker around with their tablets. So that's our smackdown between the Sony Xperia Tablet Z and the Nexus 10. Both are available now. The Sony's going to cost you $100 more, but I hope you see what they both have to offer. And in terms of features, clearly the Sony is going to be the winner. It has a whole lot more bells and whistles on it, but there's still that lovely Nexus purity right here and the higher resolution display. I'm Lisa from Mobile Tech Review. Be sure to visit our website and read our reviews of both of these products, watch our video reviews, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.